Stand directly in front of it, or at least let the image fill your screen until the edges of your reality blur. The first thing that arrests you is not the shape of the skull, but the violence of its making. Look at the left eye of Jean-Michel Basquiat's 1982 Untitled. It is not merely an eye, it is a sinkhole, a swirling vortex of black oil stick and acrylic that seems to drag the surrounding blue into its depth. It refuses to look back at you, yet it sees everything. There is no pupil, no iris. Stand directly in front of it, or at least let the image fill your screen until the edges of your reality blur. The first thing that arrests you is not the shape of the skull, but the violence of its making. Look at the left eye of Jean-Michel Basquiat's 1982 Untitled. It is not merely an eye, it is a sinkhole, a swirling vortex of black oil stick and acrylic that seems to drag the surrounding blue into its depth. It refuses to look back at you, yet it sees everything. There is no pupil, no iris, only a frenetic, spiraling void that suggests an internal vision so intense it has burned through the retina. This is not a passive portrait. It is a vibrating nerve, exposed and raw, pulsing against the constraints of the canvas. The texture itself feels less like a composition and more like a wound. Basquiat didn't just paint, he attacked. You can see the physical exertion in the jagged lines of the jaw, the teeth bared in a rictus that sits somewhere between a scream and a grin. He utilized oil stick, a medium that allowed him to draw and paint simultaneously, retaining the immediacy of a sketch while achieving the weight of a painting. The strokes are frantic, overlaid, scratched out, and reapplied. Notice the background, that electric azure blue. In traditional portraiture, the background is a setting, a context. Here it is a static charge, a chaotic atmosphere that seems to be compressing the figure, pushing it forward, threatening to crush it. The skull is suspended in this chromatic ether, untethered from a body, stripped of skin, reduced to the essential architecture of existence. To call this a memento mori, a reminder of death, is too simple, too classical for a work this visceral. This is not a meditation on the inevitable end. It is a documentation of the terrifying present. In 1982, Basquiat was 21 years old. He was young, beautiful, and rapidly ascending the dizzying heights of a predominantly white art world that treated him with a mix of adoration and exoticism. This skull is a self-portrait, but not of his face. It is a self-portrait of his psyche. It captures the dissonance of a mind racing faster than the hand can move, a consciousness grappling with the weight of perception. The frantic scribbles around the head suggest a halo, but a thorny, messy one, thoughts spilling out, uncontainable. When you look at the mouth, the grid-like teeth do not suggest speech, they suggest gnashing. There is a silence to the piece, but it is the deafening silence of an explosion captured a millisecond after detonation. The colors clash, primary reds, yellows, and blues warring with the heavy blacks and whites, creating a visual cacophony that mimics the noise of the city, the noise of the mind. It is a map of anxiety, rendered in the most confident strokes imaginable. We are not looking at a dead thing. We are looking at a living thing that has been flayed open, revealing the terrifying, beautiful machinery of the human spirit. It haunts us because it feels unfinished, not in execution, but in emotion. It is a sentence cut off mid-scream, a thought interrupted by the realization of its own mortality. To truly understand the alchemy of the paint, we must first understand the grit of the pavement from which it emerged. Before the millions, before the Armani suits splattered with acrylic, there was the crumbling masonry of late 1970s Lower Manhattan. New York City was not the polished billionaire's playground it is today. It was bankrupt, dangerous and electric. It was a city on the verge of collapse, and in the fissures of that decay, flowers grew. This was the primordial soup that birthed Jean-Michel Basquiat. He was a creature of the streets, a teenage runaway sleeping in Washington Square Park, navigating a landscape of heroin, hip-hop, and post-punk noise. He didn't begin on canvas. He began on the walls. Under the moniker SAMO, a shorthand for same old shit, Basquiat and his collaborator Al Diaz turned the city into a text. But this was not graffiti in the traditional sense of tagging a name for territory. This was public poetry. It was philosophical vandalism. SAMO as an alternative to God, they scrawled on the walls of Soho, right where the gallery owners and the art elite would see it. He was engaging in a dialogue with the art world before he was ever invited inside. He was critiquing the commodification of art while standing outside the locked doors of the institutions that sold it. The transition from the street to the studio in the early 1980s was not a cleaning up, it was a translation. When Basquiat moved to canvas, he didn't leave the street behind. He dragged the street inside with him. You can feel the urgency of the subway train in his brushwork. His paintings retain the compositional logic of a graffiti-covered wall. Layers of history, old posters ripped away to reveal text underneath, the accumulation of urban debris. He worked on anything he could find: old doors, discarded windows, refrigerator panels. The medium was the message. Everything is a surface. Everything is disposable. Everything is a canvas. This context is crucial because it explains the ferocity of his rise. He went from being homeless to being the radiant child of the art market in a heartbeat. But he never lost that street-level frequency. He brought the aesthetic of the marginalized, the scrawl, the drip, the raw, unpolished gesture, into the sterile white cube of the high art gallery. It was a disruption. He forced the elite to look at the aesthetic of poverty and see it as luxury. But there was a cost. The city that fed him was also consuming him. The heroin that was a background hum on the streets became a demon in the studio. His work from this period, including the Untitled Skull, captures this liminal space. He is standing in the doorway between the street and the salon, between obscurity and fame, between life and death. The energy in his work is the energy of survival. It's the hustle. It's the frantic need to be seen, to say, I exist, before the city wipes you away. When we look at his work, we are looking at the visual residue of a specific moment in time, a moment when New York was burning, and Basquiat was the one holding the match, illuminating the darkness for just a second before the flame burned his fingers. If you navigate the chaotic topography of Basquiat's oeuvre, you will encounter a recurring lexicon, a visual language that he developed to codify his existence. Copyright symbols, frantic lists of anatomy, chemical structures, and historical dates populate his canvases like footnotes in a frantic dissertation. But two symbols stand paramount: the crossed-out text and the crown. I cross out words so you will see them more, he famously said. It is a brilliant psychological manipulation. By obscuring the text, he creates a secret, forcing the viewer to lean in, to scrutinize, to engage in an act of discovery. It turns the passive act of looking into an active act of deciphering. He transforms the viewer into an archaeologist of his mind. And then there is the crown, simple, three-pointed, often drawn in a jagged yellow oil stick. It sits atop skeletons, boxers, jazz musicians, and often emptiness. This was Basquiat's act of canonization. He was acutely aware of the absence of black figures in the history of Western art. Museums were filled with kings and queens, but they didn't look like him. So he built his own monarchy. He crowned Charlie Parker. He crowned Joe Louis. He crowned himself. He was asserting nobility in a world that denied it to him. The crown is a symbol of power, but it is also a heavy burden. It represents the weight of representation, the pressure of being the first. This was Basquiat's act of canonization.
He was acutely aware of the absence of black figures in the history of Western art. Museums were filled with kings and queens, but they didn't look like him. So he built his own monarchy. He crowned Charlie Parker. He crowned Joe Louis. He crowned himself. He was asserting nobility in a world that denied it to him. The crown is a symbol of power, but it is also a heavy burden. It represents the weight of representation, the pressure of being the first or the only one in the room. There is a tragic, biting irony in looking at Untitled today, knowing its provenance. In 2017, this painting sold for $110.5 million to Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa. It was the highest price ever paid for an American artist at auction at that time. Even recently, lesser works like Baby Boom continue to fetch tens of millions.
Basquiat, the artist who scrawled SAMO for the so-called avant-garde on the walls of the city, who critiqued the commercialization of culture, has become the ultimate blue-chip asset. The skull that screams of existential dread now screams of capital. But to view the work only through the lens of its price tag is to commit the final indignity against the artist. The money is noise. The painting is the signal. Despite the auction paddles and the investment portfolios, the work remains dangerous. It refuses to be domesticated. The skull still stares out with that hollow, vibrating eye, challenging us. It asks us to look past the money, past the myth of the tragic genius, and see the human being who stood before the canvas, terrified and triumphant. Basquiat's skull haunts us not because it is expensive, but because it is a mirror. It reflects our own anxieties, our own mortality, and our own desire to leave a mark on a wall that will eventually be painted over. He showed us that a scribble can hold more truth than a photograph, and that a skull is not just a symbol of death, it is the container of a universe. In the end, the crown didn't save him, and the money couldn't keep him alive. But the painting remains, a permanent scream in a quiet room, demanding, forever, that we simply look.